that brings us to tonight's speaker. So tonight we have Peter D. Clark. He's a professor emeritus in chemistry from the University of Calgary. And today he'll be talking to us about what is needed to make life possible. So I will stop my share and turn it over. So Peter, I think Andrew is going to start the screen share as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I get going, just make a couple of acknowledgements. First of all, thank Susanna Nagy for inviting me to make the presentation this evening, and also to Andrew Fiera, who has done a little editing on some of my PowerPoints, making them fit on the screen. Somehow I didn't quite master that aspect of things. So thanks very much to Susanna and Andrew for helping out. Okay, so last month's lecture talked about the detection of planets around distant stars, and we could see that there are many, many different types of planets which potentially can be formed. In some ways, I'm going to follow on from that discussion, but specifically to talk about what conditions on a new planet leads to the development of life. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the material requirements. Life is really like everything else. It requires two inputs, energy and materials. And so on a new planet, we must have certain compounds, certain molecules being produced in order to make simple molecules such as amino acids, adenine, which is one of the bases found in DNA. So really, I'm going to concentrate on where these materials come from and under what circumstances they can arise. So that's the main theme. Andrew is going to do my slides. So again, appreciate it, Andrew. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm showing this iconic photo of the moon, of the Earthrise from the surface of the moon for one specific reason, or two specific reasons. One, of course, it's an incredible photograph. But secondly, and perhaps very importantly with respect to the evolution of life on a new planet, it could well be that the moon, its formation, has had a considerable influence on the development of life on Earth. So this may not necessarily be a universal requirement that a planet must have a moon for life to develop, but as we get towards the end of the lecture, then you will see how possibly the moon has made a contribution to the development of life on Earth. Next slide. Okay, so a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. After a little introduction to molecular biology, I'm sure you're all looking forward to that. I'm going to talk about the Big Bang from the viewpoint of a chemist. I'm sure you didn't realize that there is one. So I'll discuss that. Very briefly, I'll go through element synthesis in stars, supernova, etc. Talk about the importance of the process of formation of Earth's moon. And one of the key themes in this discussion is to understand how a planet such as Earth, indeed Venus, Mercury, Mars, obtained a metallic iron core. And you will see that I will use chemistry to link the production of carbon dioxide, molecular nitrogen, to the presence of metallic iron. I'll say a little bit about some of the other elements, which are, of course, used in living systems, principally carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, a very important one, sulfur, iron, and magnesium, and there's more. And towards the end of the lecture, I will try to explain why life uses only amino acids in the construction of proteins, which are left-handed. Now, that's a rather loose description of the chirality of some organic compounds, and we'll get back to that in more detail as we go through the presentation. Next slide, Andrew. Okay, so when I've done that, I'll be able to make an assessment of what the criteria are for life on a planet and be able to answer this question. If Elon Musk ever goes to Mars, will he have neighbors? Probably in fossilized form, but will he have neighbors? Was there life on Venus? And also I will examine the question of potential for life on Titan, Europa, Ganymede, and other of these large moons around Jupiter and Saturn. And lastly, of course, think about, does life exist elsewhere in our galaxy and in other galaxies? So that's the overall agenda for this evening. Next slide, Andrew. Okay, so I thought first of all I would attempt to define what life is on a molecular basis. And the reason for doing that is that it tells us what elements are needed to construct the molecules of which life is constructed. So again, I'm talking about things like amino acids, polypeptides, which are the constituents of proteins, DNA, RNA, and other crucial systems. And this subject was a topic of interest of Erwin Schrödinger, the famous physicist who was born and grew up in Austria and made great contributions to the world of chemistry, in particular building on the work of Louis de Broglie, a French scientist, who related the momentum of objects in terms of frequency and wavelength. And Schrödinger then used this start by de Broglie to essentially invent wave mechanics, which gives a precise description of how electrons behave in atoms and other issues. And I've shown the photograph of the front cover of a book, which is now, it's probably almost 30 years since it was published, written by Walter Moore, the physical chemist. And if anybody wants to learn about the life and times of Schrödinger, this is an excellent book. Okay, so Schrödinger left Austria. He held various positions in Austria and Germany. And during the build-up to the Second World War, it became very uncomfortable for him to live in his native country. And eventually, after a short spell in England, he was invited to go to an institute which was set up by Eamon de Valera, the Prime Minister of Ireland. And Schrödinger with his family moved to Dublin and was one of the principal figures in an institute for advanced studies, which was set up by de Valera. De Valera was an interesting man himself. His interest was in classical Gaelic and mathematics. And he wanted to build an institute much along the lines of the one that had been established in Princeton, which Einstein and other key scientific figures of that age went to. So Schrödinger, in his responsibilities in Dublin, he lived 17 years in Dublin. One of his responsibilities was to give general lectures. And in 1943, he gave a series of lectures on what life is. And he described it as a system which is driven from equilibrium by input of energy and materials. And he also suggested that the information that was required to construct a cell was stored within chromosomes, which are known at the time within the nucleus of cells. And he called it an aperiodic crystal. And he said it must have some kind of code which contains all of the information. And this was 10 years before Watson and Crick deduced the structure of DNA. So it was a considerable insight. And in part, Schrödinger's assessment of life being a system driven from equilibrium by energy and materials by the fact that a chromosome contains probably no more than 1 million atoms. And this doesn't fall within the domain of really equilibrium thermodynamics. And he therefore suggested that the system had to be far from equilibrium in order for life to sustain itself. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide's an interesting slide because it gives a complete degree in biochemistry. And so all those who want to take a degree in biochemistry, then this is essentially all you need to know. If there's any biochemists listening to this talk, I give you my apologies right now. Okay, so how does life work? Well, most people, I won't say everybody, but a lot of people know that the information that Schrödinger was talking about within chromosomes, which could be viewed in cells in the early 1940s, is held in deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA. And DNA is the repository of information, which is then transcribed to ribose nucleic acid, RNA, and that information is then used in a complex molecular system called a ribosome to construct proteins. It's a fascinating subject and I won't spend too much time on that, but once we have proteins, then we have the means of metabolism. So we go from a system of information and eventually through proteins and metabolism, then we can synthesize other types of compounds and generate the work necessary to sustain a living system. So that's biochemistry, all you need to know. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I couldn't go past this topic without showing you some structures, but I'm not showing these to bamboozle you with chemical structures and formulae and the type. So down in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the overall structure of a double-stranded DNA, and it consists of a chain of phosphate, deoxyribose, and linked to the deoxyribose are the bases thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine. And again, we don't have time, and it's an involved subject within the chemical domain to understand how the genetic code works. But the one thing to point out is that when we look at those molecules, the top line, thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine, you see, of course, they contain carbon, they contain oxygen, nitrogen. They contain a large amount of nitrogen, in fact. And when we look at adenine and guanine, these are based on what we call the purine ring structure. And there is a large amount of nitrogen in these molecules. So if we're going to build these molecules, then obviously we need sources of carbon compounds, nitrogen compounds. And once we have those, most of the hydrogen comes along for the ride, and we can construct these molecules. So really, I'm pointing to these structures to say, obviously, carbon, we know, is a very important element. So is hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. And later, we will add phosphorus, sulfur, selenium, and one or two others. Next slide, please. Okay, so protein synthesis occurs basically in, I wouldn't say 2 steps, there are multiple steps, but two major steps. So the DNA helix unravels under the influence of a protein. And in the living world, all transformations, perhaps not all, but nearly all transformations are orchestrated at the surface of proteins. Proteins are the catalysts that speed up all chemical reactions in living systems. So when we transcribe DNA to RNA, and in fact, this is messenger RNA, which now we are more familiar with as a result of our current predicament, It's called messenger RNA because it ferries the same information held in the DNA to a ribosome, and that ribosome is itself a mixture of proteins and RNA. And again, the molecular systems involved are quite complex, but logically so. Then we produce proteins which drive all chemical reactions, including that of transcription and translation. So proteins are absolutely important. And I've written across the bottom of this slide that in primordial chemistry, there must have been some compounds, not just the elements as I've written there, but compounds which lead to amino acids, polypeptides, and proteins. And there is still an ongoing debate as to what came first in the biological world, whether it was proteins or RNA. I'm firmly of the opinion that proteins came first, but only just. Really, proteins and RNA co-evolved together, but you couldn't possibly have had RNA, in my view, without proteins. Having said that, I should advise you that many people will disagree with what I've just said. Next slide, please. Okay, now I mentioned Schrodinger's definition of life is one that's driven from equilibrium by an input of energy and materials. So I thought it's very useful to show this molecule, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, because this is more or less the entire energy system in a living entity. It's very much like a nucleotide arrangement that you find in DNA, but this one would be found in RNA, because instead of having deoxyribose, as you find in DNA, in ATP we have ribose, where it's very slightly different. The key thing about this molecule is the chain of the 3 phosphate groups which are hanging on to the ribose molecule. Okay, so this is our energy supply, and in the next slide I will show you how it works. Okay, so if we just look at this slide, it's going to do its thing and it will repeat itself. So all energy used in living systems is a result of hydrolysis of a high energy phosphate-phosphate bond. And if we just see it one more time, then it is the rupture of this bond in a coordinated way which enables living systems and molecular systems to have the energy required to carry out all subsequent chemistry. I don't know how many grams of ATP there are in your body. I'm guessing it's actually relatively small, no more than probably 10, 50 grams. Somebody hopefully can correct me later. But you make kilograms of this material every day because ATP is used and remade billions upon billions upon billions of times in every single cell in your body. And the energy released by hydrolysis of that bond is what is captured in biochemical systems to drive life from its position of equilibrium to then a highly ordered state. Okay, next slide. The important thing about that slide is that phosphate is so important in living systems. Okay, now we get to the Big Bang from the chemistry perspective and go straight on to the next slide. And this remarkably is a consequence of the study of statistical thermodynamics by Ludwig Boltzmann, who was a physicist, another Austrian, again held various positions. And Boltzmann's major achievement was to describe thermodynamic systems using statistical approaches to describe the behavior of countless billions upon trillions and trillions of molecules. So using statistical means, he was able to derive then ways of calculating important thermodynamic parameters. And carved in onto his gravestone in a cemetery in Vienna is the equation S equals K log W. S, of course, is entropy. K is so-called Boltzmann's constant, but it's not really a constant. It's a correction or a conversion factor which converts scales of temperature into units of energy. And W is the number of states that a system can occupy. So Boltzmann deduced from statistical mechanics, thermodynamics rather, statistical mechanics came later in the early part of the 20th century, but Boltzmann deduced through this analysis that entropy was continuing to increase within the universe as a whole. So not just now an individual molecular system, but when he considered the entire universe, entropy is continuing to increase. And so therefore he logically deduced that in the past, the entropy would be less. And if you go to the extreme, then you can say that at some point you should have W equal to 1. Log of 1 in any base, this is the natural logarithm here, but log of 1 in any base is 0. So when W, the state of the system, is 1, then the entropy is 0. And so Boltzmann deduced, without any knowledge of the expanding universe or anything of that nature, as you'll appreciate, in his time, astronomy was in its early phases. Boltzmann deduced that the universe started from a single ordered state, but he could not define what it is. So this is the chemists, although Boltzmann, I think, would perhaps describe himself as a physicist. But anyway, chemists can borrow this and say that, yeah, it's the Big Bang, in fact, originated from an understanding, or the understanding that was given by statistical thermodynamics. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the periodic table, and it shows all of the elements. Principally, I'm showing it just to simply ask the question, how are the elements made? I think most of us know the answer to this question already, that they are made in stars and in the conditions developed during supernova explosions of large stars. The important elements from life's perspective, of course, is hydrogen. All of the blue ones, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, selenium. And iron is of utmost importance. You find it, of course, in hemoglobin and in many other structures embedded within proteins, which control all type of electron transfer reactions in biochemical systems. So iron is very important, magnesium, sodium, we could go on. So how are these elements made? Next slide. Well, I'm just showing the picture of the Andromeda galaxy because it's so beautiful. That galaxy, like our own, contains billions of stars. The fusion processes which are going on in these stars are creating most of the elements up to iron. And beyond that, we need a supernova explosion. So next slide, please. So this is a picture of the Crab Nebula, an image which was taken by Remy Lacasse of the Royal Astronomy Society of Canada. And the Crab Nebula was first observed, or this should I say, is the result of a supernova explosion. So a very large star has undergone a catastrophic implosion and then explosion with materials then being really shot into the surrounding space around this star. Okay, so there's a couple of things of interest that I want to point out here. Mostly the supernova it's more hydrogen, any hydrogen left over, lighter elements, carbon, etc., are fusing to heavier elements, but most of the elements larger than iron are produced in a supernova explosion. There's a couple of other interesting things about this. If you think about what happens during and shortly after a supernova, the event occurs, and it's calculated that initially the materials are ejected into space at around a quarter to maybe half the speed of light. So if we think about that in terms of our sun and Earth, if the sun became a supernova, which it won't, by the way, but if it did, then the materials ejected from the star would reach the orbit of Earth within half an hour, traveling at a quarter of the speed of light. And so within a few hours, a few days, then this material has traversed an enormous distance through space. The other interesting thing about this picture is, and I'm not exactly sure how Remy recorded the colors on this, but this is still a very energetic system, because the fact that we see color means that energy is being exchanged between the atoms, perhaps the molecules, which are beginning to form in this system. So light is emitted as a result of the atoms becoming energized through the very large amount of energy that is associated with a supernova. This, I just want to emphasize this point. Light is probably responsible for most of the chemistry, or energizing most of the chemistry, which occurs in interstellar space. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this isn't such a good diagram. It's a little fuzzy. And I was saying to Andrew that there's both pluses and minuses when you have a slide that's not perfect like this. The reason is because the audience now has to strain to look, to understand, and to actually see what it is I'm trying to say. The first thing I want to note here, that this is a logarithmic scale. So the abundance of the elements then given in this diagram are in a logarithmic scale. So if we look at silicon, silicon is used as the benchmark to which all atoms, other atoms, are compared in this logarithmic scale. So silicon, there is 1 million atoms, and as you can see, magnesium next door, oxygen, carbon are more abundant, but the most abundant of all is hydrogen. Helium, I'm not worrying about because it's an inert gas, it doesn't do any chemistry. But it's on this logarithmic scale, we see that hydrogen by far is the most abundant element still in the universe. Of course, it's gradually being consumed in new stars. I often wonder how long it will take for all of this hydrogen to be consumed. Anyway, that's another issue. So the other thing to point out, that approximately around the atomic number of 25, you can see iron. There's also two plots there. One is for even atomic number elements, such as carbon, oxygen, magnesium, iron, and the lower one for the odd numbered elements in terms of their atomic number. For those electric car enthusiasts, I'll just point out that element number 3, lithium, you can see has a very low abundance. Of course, this doesn't mean that it's in short supply. There is a large amount of it, but it's not like digging up iron ore. If we go to look at iron, then we see that it's much, much more abundant than lithium. This diagram is a very important diagram because rates of chemical reactions are dictated by the collisions of species with one another. Two molecules or two elements must encounter one another before a chemical bond can be formed. So if you have very little of an element, then it's quite or less likely that it will be involved in chemistry. Okay, the other compound or element I want to point out is phosphorus. And phosphorus, as you can see, is around element number 15. And it is of considerably lower abundance than carbon, oxygen, magnesium, iron, all elements very important to life. So phosphorus is actually a limiting element in the development of living species. Now, you could ask the question immediately, why did life choose phosphorus? Because it's not very abundant. Why didn't it choose arsenic? This is all to do with the chemistry that's involved and the ability of that molecule ATP to be able to coordinate magnesium ions within its structure, because the magnesium ion is exactly the right size in order to coordinate within an ATP structure. Next slide. Okay, so what happens after a supernova? I've written just in general terms the abundance. So hydrogen is much more abundant than oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. The atoms, as they are ejected into space, are most likely to encounter hydrogen just because of its abundance. Now, you could say, you might be arguing, well, the star has consumed most of the hydrogen, so there's none left. But in fact, there's a lot of hydrogen in space around a star, because the gravitational well of the star attracts hydrogen from interstellar space. So there is always hydrogen being sucked in to a solar system with a large star. So hydrogen reacts with oxygen to make water, reacts with carbon to make methane. Hydrogen reacts with nitrogen to make ammonia. Hydrogen reacts with phosphorus to make phosphine, pH 3. These are some of the initial compounds that would be produced, and it's a very brief glimpse of what would be going on, because there are lots of other elements. But what I'm suggesting is reaction with hydrogen is very likely, and indeed spectroscopic measurements in interstellar space show that these hydrides are relatively easy to find, because indeed there is quite a lot of these compounds there. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about the abundant metals? And I've just chosen magnesium, calcium, aluminum, silicon, iron. These again react to produce hydrides if they encounter hydrogen. These compounds, hydrides, metal hydrides, are very reactive. They will rapidly react with water or hydroxyl radicals, which are produced by all this light energy in the supernova. So we end up with hydroxides. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture of dust clouds in interstellar space. And we've just really given enough chemistry, just barely enough, to understand what these dust clouds are. So next slide, please. All right, so if I take these hydroxides and I condense them, then I can make a composite mineral based on the amount of magnesium, calcium, silicon, iron, etc. And again, this is a simplified picture because I've left out other elements which will be mixed up in there, such as strontium and so on, many others. And again, the dust that's formed then is a composite mineral. And as you can see from the picture, still on this diagram, that the dust is absorbing a lot of light and obscuring the stars which are beginning to form within this dust cloud. And the dust cloud, as it becomes larger and larger, and you can appreciate this cloud is probably several light years across, is then a nursery for star formation. Okay, next slide. Okay, interstellar chemistry is is more complex, and I thought I'd just show you a few other reactions which depend on the dust that's formed. So the surface of a dust particle is able to catalyze all types of reactions, and driven by energy, which is light energy, both visible and ultraviolet, then we can start to form molecular nitrogen. Methane can be reformed with water to make carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide can react with water to produce more, or to produce carbon dioxide and hydrogen. It's quite interesting when I've looked in the literature, and it may not, my investigations may not be complete, because for the last year and a half almost, I've been denied access to libraries which you can saunter around in and learn things. But from what I can see, molecular nitrogen and carbon dioxide are very low abundant species in interstellar space. This immediately raises the question, where does molecular nitrogen and carbon dioxide come from in a planetary system? Next slide. Go. So I'm going to move on to planet formation. Next slide. This is an amazing image, and this is of a star, HL Tauri, which is measured to be no more, this is a solar system, a forming solar system around a star. The star is in the middle, and the bright bands are materials beginning to accumulate around the star. So this is a forming solar system, and it's only 1 million years old, and it's hundreds of light years from Earth. A remarkable picture, which was gathered using the array at Atacama in Chile. So it's interesting again to think about, okay, so what's going on here? This system, this forming solar system, is increasing in temperature as it's formed, and it's increasing in temperature because of two reasons, I think. One is that you have accretion of small objects which are bumping into one another, and so frictional heating is raising the temperature. But the star is also beginning to emit infrared, visible, UV. The materials, the molecules which are attracted around this star then are being warmed by radiant heating. So we're absorbing infrared, UV, many, many different processes. So this is an amazing thing, but I want to focus on one aspect of this, which is very important to my discussion, and that is, how did the planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and some other objects in our solar system get an iron core? So we're going to move on to that. Next slide. Okay, so here, I've taken this from a textbook, as you can see from the reference here. So this is what is envisaged to be, that as a planet forms, molten iron, which is accumulating in the planet, segregates to the center. So you have a solid iron core. It's solid at very high temperature because of the high pressure, and a liquid iron outer core. There is one problem in understanding how this could be, because if you look in interstellar space, you can't find metallic iron. And indeed, that HL Tauri system, the spectroscopic analysis of the light which is coming from it, shows the presence of carbon monoxide and ferrous iron, Fe2 iron, but not metallic iron. Now, it could be that it's not so easy to detect metallic iron, but I have a different explanation as to where the iron has come from. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we think about the chemistry that's going on as a solar system begins to form, the solar system and the objects within it, especially the ones close to the star, are beginning to get very, very hot. So the methane that I'd formed after the supernova, the methane cannot survive the accretion process of making a reasonably large planet. So the methane will decompose to carbon. Carbon will react with water, which is stable to almost 2000 degrees Celsius, and it will make carbon monoxide and hydrogen. So an important message here is that no carbon compounds can survive accretion of a planet like Earth. So when Earth was first formed, there was no possibility of organic material surviving this initial period. Perhaps organic material reigned in later, but we can't be sure. The other issue here is that in that HL Tauri system, only carbon monoxide was observed. And again, CO2 is more difficult to observe. But nevertheless, I can easily explain using very well-known chemistry why there's no carbon dioxide in a solar system initially, or very little. And that is because the excess hydrogen reacts with carbon dioxide to form carbon monoxide and water. Okay, so we must have an explanation then of how organic material was eventually remade on a planet which eventually supported life. And so we'll work towards that. Next slide, please. Okay, so iron then is formed in the set of reactions shown in this slide. Iron oxide, which I've represented very simply as just FeO, can react with hydrogen to make metallic iron and water. Iron oxide is also reduced by carbon monoxide to metallic iron, and it produces carbon dioxide. So the carbon that has been produced in a forming solar system and in the planets that form in that system then can react with iron oxide, and the result is carbon dioxide. And the carbon monoxide can be replenished, as you can see, by reaction of elemental carbon with water to make carbon monoxide and hydrogen. This is essentially the same chemistry that goes on in conversion of iron oxide to steel in a steel plant. So there is nothing magical. But we can say for sure, and I've got in red there, I've made the statement that there's elemental carbon on carbon monoxide and hydrogen as hydrogen or water. How do I know this? Well, I can easily ascertain this by just thinking about the bond strengths in the various molecules in relation to the temperature, which I've said is around 1500 C, but also using Boltzmann's methods with help from other thermodynamicists, Gibbs, who put together all of the necessary information to calculate precisely a system at equilibrium. So when chemists say, we say something, we actually know it's true. That's a bold statement, isn't it? But I can be absolutely sure that methane cannot survive accretion of a planet such as Earth, which has got very hot. Next slide, please. Iron then is linked to carbon dioxide production, and I think also molecular nitrogen. The reason is because if we go down this slide, we see that ammonia is in equilibrium with nitrogen and hydrogen. And the only element that can catalyze decomposition of ammonia is iron. When I say only, there are actually two others, ruthenium and osmium. But if you go back to my diagram, you'll see that there's such small amounts of ruthenium and osmium that this simply would have very little impact. But I've just described a system where metallic iron is formed in a forming solar system, and any ammonia that's being pulled in from interstellar space, having been formed in interstellar space, is converted to molecular nitrogen. The important thing about this reaction is that ammonia, its conversion to nitrogen and hydrogen, is reversible. All I have to do is change the conditions. So if I increase the pressure enormously and lower the temperature, let's say somewhere in the 200 to 500 degree range, essentially all of the nitrogen and hydrogen will exist as ammonia. So this tells me that ammonia must have been reformed on Earth by this process. There is no alternative. Others have been suggested, and I won't get into the discussion and the arguments as to the validity of these arguments, but it would seem that ammonia is reformed on Earth after its formation. Next slide, please. Okay, So Earth and Venus are very similar planets in many respects. They're the same size. They both have iron cores, of course, a matter which was deduced from measuring the densities of the planets remotely, obviously. And both undoubtedly had dense atmospheres of carbon dioxide and nitrogen. But Venus is much closer to the sun, and it will have lost its water to dissociation to hydrogen and oxygen. So nearly all of the carbon ended up as carbon dioxide. Probably there's very little as carbonates, because the time period over which liquid water existed on Earth was, the period over which water existed on Venus was very limited, so there may be no carbonate rocks. But nevertheless, Venus has a dense carbon dioxide atmosphere and nitrogen, and it now has a runaway greenhouse effect and a very high surface temperature, over 400 degrees centigrade. I'll tell you an interesting thing about Venus. Okay, so it's very high pressure atmosphere. It's almost 100 times higher pressure than on Earth. And if you calculate the amount of nitrogen, even though it's only 4 or 5%, there is more nitrogen on Venus, in the atmosphere of Venus, than there is on Earth. But there's one key difference between Earth and Venus, and that Earth has a moon, and that resulted from a very energetic collision. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's just a nice picture. This object that's hitting proto-Earth is usually termed Theia, and I've renamed it Alfie. And there is a quiz tonight, though Alfie is an acronym which I've put together. And if you can guess or work out what Alfie means, then I will give to that lucky person a 2022 calendar from the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And you can either send me your answer, oh, first of all, people who would ask questions tonight, they can make a stab at what Alfie might mean. And if not, then you can send me an email, and the first person who gets it correct, then we'll get this wonderful calendar. Okay, so I've given you a clue here. It means a something, something, something. That's as much as I'm giving you. Next slide, please. Okay, so the impact of Theia, or Alfie, if you wish, the temperatures exceed 5,000 degrees Celsius. This means that every mineral that has already formed, and this happened probably about 30 million years after formation of proto-Earth, the surface temperatures are such that all of these minerals are dissociated into atoms and flung into space and held within the gravitational field of Earth. Extremely hot, 5,000 degrees, no bond. There isn't a single bond that can withstand a temperature of 5,000 degrees. So all of the materials on Earth exist in that period then as simply atoms floating around, held within the gravitational field of the planet. Now, as those atoms react to reform molecules because energy is being radiated out into space, the system cools and molecules start to become formed once again, and minerals reform. And here I think is a very important point, is that this highly energetic system mixed everything so thoroughly that when minerals started to reform, then you must have a homogeneously mixed system, given that the bond strength between the mineral, the metal, the oxide, and so on are the same. I'm making a rather loose assumption that the rate of formation will also be the same. Okay. Also, you start to reform gases, molecular nitrogen, carbon monoxide, water, and so on. And any iron that got reoxidized to iron oxide in this process will react with more carbon, because remember, all carbon now doesn't exist as even carbon monoxide. It's just elemental carbon. So the chemistry I described before, then gives you the situation where iron will be reformed in its metallic state. Next question, next slide, please. Okay, so here then is a proposal which, if you again look in the literature, you probably won't find it because people have not discussed it in these terms. But how did Earth get its iron core when Venus, Mercury, and others? I think it's this carbon chemistry, and essentially a planet, a forming planet, operates like a giant steelworks. Next slide. Okay, iron is likely the key to life. In order to start making molecules like amino acids, proteins, etc., polypeptides, proteins, you need hydrogen. And iron reacts with water in the temperature range I've shown to give you iron oxide and hydrogen. So you may have been asking yourself the question, well, we know we have lots of iron oxide as ores of various types on Earth. Where did it come from? Well, from reoxidation of iron by water, which provided ammonia. Iron catalyzes ammonia production. We discussed that earlier. So now hydrogen and nitrogen reform ammonia at very high pressure, and hydrocarbons are also reformed on iron surfaces in a branch of chemistry known as Fischer-Tropsch chemistry, and you can produce a vast array of different organic compounds, and all of these reactions are favored at high pressure. Next slide. Okay, the fact that it's favored at high pressure, and particularly just talking about ammonia synthesis for the moment, if you have the situation that's depicted in the diagram to the left, where oceans have condensed, so maybe this has happened 500 million years or so after formation of planet Earth, then you have a depth of ocean which is 3 to 5 kilometers in depth. The pressure at the seabed under this column of water is enormous. All nitrogen and hydrogen in the system, if we use now just equilibrium calculations, predicts you have nothing other than ammonia. Some nitrogen, as it's percolating up through this seabed, will not find hydrogen or will not find an iron surface, but nevertheless, this is the most logical way in which we could form ammonia. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're wrapping up into the closing stages. I hope I'm not going to go on too long here. You probably can only, the only way you can cut me off is by terminating the, anyway, I won't get into that. Okay, so what do we need to focus on now? Well, we've seen I can reform hydrocarbons, I can make ammonia, water, sulfur would be in the form of hydrogen sulfide. If you mix all of these things together, you can make amino acids, which will eventually lead to polypeptides and proteins. Next slide. Okay, so back in the early 1950s, in fact, the same year that the structure of DNA was deduced, Stanley Miller did some experiments. Stanley Miller was a graduate student, and he demonstrated that if you take a mixture of gases that I've given here, carbon monoxide, CO2, methane, hydrogen, ammonia, and some source of energy, it could be electric discharge, heat, or light, then you make amino acids. And the ones which are made in the highest concentration are glycine, alanine, aspartic acid, and glutamic acid. So in these what's termed Miller-type experiments, then these 4 amino acids are the major species. So we've shown, Miller showed, and many other people repeated his work, did it in many different ways, and showed that amino acids are readily made from this mixture of gases. Next slide, please. Okay, now I asked the question right at the beginning, why did life only use so-called left-handed amino acids in the production of polypeptides and proteins? Here is, for those who are not familiar with this subject, is a picture of alanine, and there are 2 stereoisomers which are distinguished only in the sense that they are mirror images of one another. Surprisingly, perhaps, it doesn't matter how hard you try, twist this molecule around and try and superimpose the L isomer on the D isomer, you cannot do it. It's like trying to superimpose your left and right hand. It can't be done. And I think most people are aware of this. But the amazing thing is that life depends completely on the fact that polypeptides, the constituent molecules of proteins, use only the L isomers. But in Miller-type chemistry, when you analyze the products that you've got, alanine was a compound that was made, you find that there is an equal mixture of the L and the D isomer. So how could you possibly then get a system that can distinguish between these two stereoisomers, which have identical energies and therefore should react at the same rates with different compounds? The answer is given in the next slide. Okay, this might be difficult for the non-chemist in the audience to fully get to grips with here, but what I've done here is just drawn a composite mineral, just a two-dimensional surface structure. And you see highlighted in red in the middle of this structure is the magnesium and P. It's not phosphorus, it's dihydrogen phosphate. And it's surrounded by other elements which crudely represent then the abundance of the elements as produced in a supernova event and in production of elements in stars prior to the supernova event. So this surface arrangement of ions, all of these are charged species, this is asymmetric in structure. And this is what you need for chiral objects such as our hands to distinguish. If you interact, if my hand interacts with a glove, the left glove, then it fits perfectly. If I try to interact it with the right glove, it doesn't fit. Okay, so what you have then is a composite mineral which is asymmetric in structure, and it's asymmetric because of the abundance of the elements that are produced in stars and supernova. Now, I've assumed here that I've made the assumption, I can't justify it tonight, it's another lecture or more, that amino acids polymerize to polypeptides and proteins at this magnesium phosphate site. And I've worked out the surface chemistry to explain that, but I'm not going to go into that tonight. So the fact that you have a certain abundance of elements means that when you start to couple amino acids together, they experience an asymmetric influence, both in terms of structure and energy. And that means there is a slight difference in the rate of reaction between reaction of a L isomer with an L isomer and an L isomer with a D. And so this is simply then a function of the asymmetric nature of the mineral, which is produced as a planet forms. Next slide. Okay, so we're talking just very briefly about phosphate. I've said it's very important and it's vital to life. So let's think about that in more detail in the next slide. I've already said that phosphorus is a relatively rare element compared to carbon and of course magnesium, hydrogen, a lot of other things. So during this formation of the moon, by this very energetic collision, all phosphorus would have been converted to phosphoric acid. And that acid would then have combined with basic oxides in reformation of minerals to form the mineral which I showed in the previous slide, albeit that was just a two-dimensional representation. So then the deduction is that this phosphate, although relatively rare, actually controls the stereochemistry through its arrangement in this asymmetric mineral site. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a few slides to conclude here. So metallic ion, these are my factors, and perhaps not just mine, that determine the development of life on a new planet. What I'm thinking is that you need metallic iron for production of ammonia and hydrocarbons. The reduction of iron oxide by carbon or carbon monoxide leads to formation of carbon dioxide. Ammonia is crucial for amino acids, so you must have a lot of ammonia. And the most logical source of ammonia is reaction of nitrogen with hydrogen on an iron surface at very high pressure. And also, for life to develop, you must have a mechanism that can distinguish between L and D amino acids. So the question I have at the bottom, was the homogeneous mineral that must have resulted after formation of the moon, is it a crucial step in production of systems which lead to living systems? Next slide. Okay, so now I can talk about life on other planets. Venus was probably a water world for almost 1 billion years. Its chemistry would have been almost identical to that on Earth. I actually find it inconceivable that life did not develop on Venus. But as the atmosphere warmed and water was lost, of course, life would have been snuffed out. So in my view, Venus was a twin for Earth, but only for maybe up to 500 million to 1 billion years. Next slide, please. If you look at the conditions relative or the material formation on Mars, I think it's very likely that there was sufficient ammonia and other materials that I've talked about to produce simple bacterial systems for perhaps the first 1 billion or even 2 billion years. The question I have, the uncertainty I have is, was the water column creating high enough pressure to produce enough ammonia in order to make amino acids, proteins, and all of the other biomolecules that you need? But I've put there, I think progression to multicellular organisms on Mars would have been unlikely. And that was because it took close to 3 billion years for this to occur on Earth, and conditions on Mars probably did not remain favorable for 3 billion years. Next slide, please. Okay, so could anybody live on Mars? Well, you'd have to grow your own food. So you need sources of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, amongst many other things. And you need to make ammonia. You need to have sulfur in the form of sulfuric acid in order to liberate phosphate. But there's one very interesting thing. The mineable reserves of phosphate on Earth are a consequence of biological action. The phosphate reserves that you find principally in Morocco and Tunisia are the remains of multicellular organisms. The other issue is sulfur. In order to liberate phosphate from calcium phosphate, if it exists on Mars, you also need sulfur. But that sulfur is concentrated on Earth, mostly in fossil fuel. And when you isolate and purify fossil fuels, you end up with a lot of elemental sulfur, which in fact drives our agriculture and manufacturing economies. And then there's the small matter of keeping warm on Mars. It's very cold, so therefore you need a very intense supply of energy. Okay, next slide. So these large objects, Ganymede, a moon of Jupiter, it has a magnetic field which strongly infers it's got a liquid iron core. And it's conceivable that such a moon, buried within these layers of ice and snow and probably some minerals, again, there could have been some living organisms. Remember, you need iron in order to make ammonia. And the nitrogen and the hydrogen, which are within that moon, possibly have been producing ammonia. Titan is a much more interesting object because, for one reason, people think it doesn't have an iron core. But my guess is that metallic iron is dispersed throughout its substructure, because the original steelworks did not produce liquid iron, they produced solid iron. So people mixed up charcoal with iron oxide, heated it up to about, they could only get to around 800 degrees C, and you form iron, metallic iron. And so it's possible that you have produced ammonia on Titan. And in fact, it's been observed on Titan. The atmosphere is mostly molecular nitrogen, which infers at one time it was hot enough to decompose ammonia catalytically. And you can decompose ammonia catalytically on an iron surface at 600 or 700 degrees C. So my guess is that Titan is a strong candidate for having produced replicating systems. How far it has got, I don't know. Could it ever have reached the stage of life that we have on Earth? Definitely no, because all carbon dioxide would be solid. So therefore photosynthesis could never develop. Okay, final slide, I think. So does life exist elsewhere? And this, of course, is another amazing photograph, this time from the Hubble telescope. Does life exist elsewhere in the universe? I feel absolutely 100% sure that life exists throughout the universe. But, and I've put one proviso on here, phosphate will always be a limiting factor for an industrialized civilization. Most people probably aren't aware that mineable reserves of phosphate on Earth will last less than 500 years, probably only around 250 years. This means we can't sustain a population of 8 or 9 billion people beyond that time. Don't get too depressed about that, because population will decrease, hopefully in an organized way, and then we will use the very limited amount of phosphate that is dispersed throughout the Earth's crust. It's only around 700 to 1,000 parts per million of phosphate in the Earth's crust. The deposits in Morocco are as high as 35% phosphate. This is how life has concentrated phosphate. So does life exist? Yes, I think it must exist, but an industrialized civilization that's capable of communicating and having an intense manufacturing industrialized system will have a finite period if a high population is required to sustain such a system. And now the very last slide, I think. Okay. Questions? Does anybody know who Alfie is?
It's Don here.
Yeah.
Don.
Hello, Peter.
Don, thank you.
Making a wild guess. It's a life-forming impact event.
No, wrong.
Okay.
A few other guesses here, so I'll go through them in order. From Lee, a lunar formed impacted Earth.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
No, there's a few other guesses here at Alfie in the chat.
Okay.
So the first one from Lee, a lunar formed impacted Earth.
No.
All right, from Susanna, a life forming interstellar event.
No, but closer.
From Janet, all life is formed in explosions.
No. Have people actually been listening to the talk or just thinking about this silly acronym? Are there any real questions, or are you so bamboozled by this whole thing?
Don't see. Let's see.
That was a wonderful talk, Peter. That was absolutely wonderful.
Yes.
John, you know, I know I paid you a lot of money to say that, but that's really
No,
really
no,
nice
it was absolutely mind-boggling. It was really, really good and mind-opening. It was really good.
Thank you.
Peter, question from me. Is there an implication here that without a lunar forming type of event, a major collision in Earth's history, that complex life would never have formed?
Well, what I have said is that undoubtedly the moon forming event had a significant influence on the chemistry of early Earth. And what I've said is that the homogeneously mixed mineral must be asymmetric once it's solidified and create this means of forming or selecting left-handed amino acids. Okay, but it's the structure of this mineral is actually dependent on the amount of each element that's formed in stars and in supernova events. So when the Earth first formed, it had a composition which was related, of course, directly related to the amount of each element that's been accumulating in our region of space. Okay, the elements form in the amounts they do because of the relative stability of the nuclei. So this is a constant. So it could well be that if the Earth had not been subjected to this moon-forming event, that it would still have had the same composition. And the mineral that first solidified would have looked pretty much the same. The difference, the one thing about the moon-forming event for Earth is that it added, I think, roughly 10% of the mass of our planet. And that could well have affected the retention of gases, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and others on which we depend for life to start. So the answer is, I think that the moon forming event definitely had some influence, but I can't be sure that it's an overriding influence, and I think probably it isn't. That would be my, I guess, my best estimate to answer that question.
All right, we do have a question. I'll throw out one more Alfie one before I get to that question, because another one just came in. A life-forming impact event?
Incorrect.
So getting to the actual question from William Wall, are there any possible conditions in the universe in which the other chirality of amino acids would be favored?
That's an interesting question, and I'll try to answer it by delving a little bit more deeply into this composite mineral which I showed, which, you know, it really is, it's not accurate. I showed a two-dimensional surface picture just of the arrangement of the various ions that you might find in the surface structure. Such a surface structure would be highly disordered in the sense of its three-dimensional shape. But nevertheless, the composition should be the same. Okay, so with this mineral, which I've said is produced simply as a consequence of the abundance of the elements, it can't be any different, at least within this stage of the development of the universe. Imagine a universe where all hydrogen has been consumed and, you know, we have lesser amounts of small molecules, then I think things are completely different. But my guess is that this two-dimensional structure which I've showed gives a reasonable representation. And what it says is that, if you can imagine, so here's the two-dimensional mineral, which is my right hand. Here comes a molecule of alanine, and it sits on it. And this is the left-handed isomer. And if the right-handed isomer comes and sits, then it will experience a different interaction energetically. And this is the important thing. You can only select the L isomer condensing with another L isomer if the rate of reaction is faster. And the rate of reaction depends on the energy of activation. And so the way these two types of molecules interact must mean that L isomers react slightly faster with one another than they do with D enantiomers, or L reacting with D enantiomers. So it will always be, I believe, believe is the wrong word to use when you're trying to explain things from a physical basis, but I can't say I'm sure, so I'm going to say I believe that it will always be left-handed amino acids and proteins. And let me say, if you can make proteins which contain mixtures of L and D, but they don't work. Catalytically, they're useless. The rates of reaction are either inconsequential, you don't get the same things. So proteins are so important because they speed up a normal chemical reaction millions of times faster than would occur in the absence of the protein structure. The protein structure is entirely dependent on having L amino acids in an array. If you have a mixture of L and D, it's simply the rates of reactions are way lower, and in fact, most of them don't work at all. So I think the interaction of the L enantiomers and reaction of one L enantiomer adsorbed on this mineral. And again, I didn't attempt to show you the chemistry. It's not complicated, but it would have taken a lot of time to go through it, which we didn't have. So it will always be an L enantiomer that reacts with another L enantiomer. And by the way, there are mechanisms which you can doodle around. So all of my chemistry here is just done on a piece of paper. You play around with these mechanisms and you can draw other mechanisms which show you how the unused D enantiomer can be interconverted back to the L enantiomer. And so the system quickly selects to make polypeptides and eventually proteins which contain mostly L enantiomers. So I think the structure of the mineral will always be the same because it's related to the elemental composition relating from fusion in stars and supernova.
All right, here's another question. Is there a way we could artificially manufacture phosphate? Could we collect materials for it from space or from another planet or moon?
Okay, so phosphate, as I've said, is very interesting. If you look at the Earth's crust in general, it contains somewhere between 700 to 1,000 parts per million by weight of phosphate. And these concentrated deposits couldn't possibly have existed on primordial Earth. Okay, so unless, and so these phosphate deposits have originated then through bioaccumulation, mostly through multicellular organisms. So once multicellular organisms that had strong cellular coatings containing phosphates, like our bones contain calcium phosphate and the like, then these microorganisms concentrated phosphate. So one of the reasons why life took 3 billion years to develop to multicellular organisms on Earth is probably that the chemistry, which I didn't show you, slowly extracts the phosphate from this rock. Okay, so it's 700 to 1,000 parts per million. It won't be any different on Mars if there have been no concentrating effects. It won't be any different on these other solar system objects, Titan and the like, unless life developed. So this is I think the amazing thing, at least to me, is that life has developed to complex forms, such as ourselves, all animals, fungi, everybody, reliant on the fact that life itself concentrated the phosphate. So the question then would be, really, that it was asked, is, are there chemical means of extracting the phosphate? I would probably say no. If you went to Mars and you said, okay, where am I going to get my phosphate from? Then you could say, well, there's probably 700 to 1,000 ppm of phosphate, so all I've got to do is mine it and process it. Now you're talking about processing trillions of tons of rock. And so the energy requirement to do this would be formidable. And on Earth, we mine these phosphate deposits called apatites in Morocco and elsewhere. And then it's processed using sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid is made from elemental sulfur. And the only reason we have elemental sulfur in the quantities we do is because we extract it in various ways from fossil fuels, such as some types of natural gas and also heavy crude oils, such as our infamous oil sands oils. I'm not trying to plug the oil sands here, but let me say the oil sands is one of the largest repositories of sulfur in the world. And it would sustain Canada in sulfur for many, many thousands of years. So what I'm saying is that you could extract this phosphate, mine this stuff, but you would probably need sulfuric acid. So now you have the second problem, let's say it's on Mars, where you need to make sulfuric acid. So the question is, how would you do that? Well, in one of my slides, I noted the fact that we know there is iron sulfate, ferric sulfate on the surface of Mars. And in fact, you can probably get, well, you can decompose ferric sulfate. First of all, it decomposes to sulfur trioxide. And then you can capture that sulfur trioxide with water and make sulfuric acid. So it's feasible on Mars. You can make sulfuric acid in a different way. But again, you've got to collect probably many, many tons of surface materials containing ferric sulfate. And so again, this becomes a formidable exercise. So extraction of phosphate, unless life has done it for you, I think is very, very difficult.
All right.
Setting aside a moral issue, just strictly from a thing, would it even be feasible, the idea of putting a type form of bacteria into underground Mars to let it do the work for you?
Yeah. It really, I don't know the answer to the question, obviously, but, and again, to explain this chemistry that I didn't explain related to the production of polypeptides and proteins on this mineral surface, I showed this magnesium dihydrogen phosphate site. And when you go through the chemistry, it shows how phosphate is extracted into an organic compound called acetyl phosphate. And so probably for the first 500 million years or so on Earth, then not life as we recognize it in bacterial form, but some pre-system, which is self-replicating, because by this time RNA and then DNA had been formed, that it's this initial chemistry which extracts the phosphate. And so it's the process of life which starts accumulation of phosphate in the biosphere. And I think, and I say think because obviously I don't know, that after the moon impact and things cooled down, probably from about, and then once the oceans rained down and you had this huge column of water, you have high pressure ammonia or formation of ammonia at high pressure. You must have ammonia, or otherwise you can't make amino acids. You need other materials as well, the organics that I've mentioned made by Fischer-Tropsch chemistry. But it's the coupling of amino acids to make polypeptides and proteins, which is extracting the phosphate from the rock, according to my chemistry. And I must say that if you try and look this up, you won't find anything in the literature on it. Okay, it's not make-believe, because I've got these mechanisms essentially you know, by applying chemical principles on how things should react and likewise and so on and so forth. And, you know, this is what it says. If you couple amino acids on a magnesium dihydrogen phosphate site, eventually the phosphate is taken up into an organic compound, which eventually becomes first acetyl phosphate, and then ATP can be produced. There's a lot of biochemistry involved in that. And if you guys could ever stomach about 2 hours of complete biochemistry on surface chemistry mechanisms, I'd be more than happy to tell you. But I didn't include any of it tonight. I knew I didn't have time. And it's a very chemical aspect of the matter that I've been discussing. I think I've even forgotten what the question was now.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through some of these. I'm going to go through these in the reverse order, just because the first two do relate to the phosphate question. So Phil is asking if you could recap how phosphate is important to an industrialized society.
Okay. So phosphate, as we've seen, is incorporated into very important biomolecules, ATP, DNA, RNA, and there's a bunch of others too. So if we don't have our phosphate, then life is impossible. Okay, and how it's important to an industrialized society is that these apatite deposits, which are as much as 35% phosphate, are mined. Morocco holds 70% of the world's reserves of phosphate. And that phosphate is digested with sulfuric acid, turned into ammonium phosphates and other phosphate fertilizers. And those phosphate fertilizers are responsible or make it possible to have the food output that we have today. If you took fertilizer, commercial fertilizer, out of the equation of an industrialized system, you'd probably be back to supporting a population of that no bigger than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So around 1.5 billion people can be supported on just agriculture, where you're recycling manures, animal wastes of all types. We have gone from a population of 1.5 billion to now nearly 8 billion because of the availability of phosphate. And here's another very interesting fact. You can't make these phosphate fertilizers unless you have sulfuric acid. 90% of the sulfuric acid used in making phosphate fertilizers originates from fossil fuel. So if we went cold turkey and stopped using fossil fuel tomorrow, within 3 months, the world's supply of sulfur would dwindle to nothing, because there is only about 3 months supply. And then farmers would not receive phosphate fertilizers, and there are many types, and food production would start to dwindle. It would take several years because they've added some phosphate fertilizer to the soil. There is the natural phosphate. It takes a while to exhaust the phosphate supplies. Some soils are almost inexhaustible. So if you go to the plains of Manitoba, you see this beautiful dark dirt, which is this topsoil. It's a layer. It's about 5 or 6 meters deep. This is rich in phosphate because it's all organic material, which still contains the phosphate. So some soils are very fertile, but for instance, if you went to sandy type soils, there's hardly any phosphate, and you can only make them fertile by adding fertilizer, mostly in the form of nitrogen fertilizers, phosphate fertilizers, potassium, and you also need sulfur, magnesium, bits of calcium, glycose, and so forth. So the interesting thing, and this is how I first started to really, many years ago, the last 10 years of my career before I retired, I became interested in how the transition from fossil fuel energy to solar, wind, basically just electricity, how this would affect materials supply. And this is one very important issue. Phosphate there's probably only 250 years supply of readily mineable phosphate on this planet. Then we will have to work out how to recycle, very difficult to do. And we will have to try and capture the phosphate, which is wasted, goes into the river systems. We have to be very careful about that. So, if you extend this argument back into the astronomical world, will we ever receive a signal from another civilization in space? Their phosphate supplies will be pretty much the same as ours. So they'll have a 200 to 500 year window in which they can sustain almost, let's say excess food production. We have excess food production. We waste a lot of it. We waste 30% of our food. So after that 500 years, industrialized systems will change because population will have to become much lower. As I've said, we can get by on the residual phosphate, but we need a much lower population. So the question is, how long does an industrialized society capable of sending a signal to another star system, how long does it last? From phosphate alone, I can guess that it's no more than 10,000 years. So we can now answer or I can suggest an answer to the question. will we ever receive a signal from another civilization? The answer is only if their ability to produce large amounts of food and also maintain industrialized systems, which, by the way, require sulfur and sulfuric acid, that there's probably only 10,000 years. And if that 10,000 years doesn't overlap with our 10,000 years, then we won't hear from them. That's a terrible thought, isn't it?
Well, that sort of skips over the next question, which was related to that. But yes, it's a very sobering thought.
Yeah,
so-
as I've said, don't be too depressed, because all it means is that we have to reduce world population. We have to work out ways how, not to waste materials on trivia. I won't say what I think trivia is. And we have to focus on organized society if we want to maintain a sophisticated industrial system.
All right, moving on to another question from Jean Malone. It has been suggested that the atmosphere of Venus might be a possible place for life to have survived because there is considerable water vapor in it, although sulfuric acid becomes more and more concentrated at lower altitudes. Do you think there are chemical reasons why this is not a viable idea?
Yeah, I think it's, I hate to pour cold water on this. There was a paper recently published on this. The reason is because you need not just carbon, you need not just phosphorus, but you need magnesium, you need calcium, you need iron, you need sulfur, which is there as sulfuric acid, but that sulfuric acid chemically is as highly oxidized as sulfur can get. And mostly living systems use reduced sulfur. So you need reducing conditions, which is what Schrödinger was saying, that a system which exists far from equilibrium is usually reduced. Okay, so it's got a low entropy, and as it moves towards equilibrium, then it becomes less reduced. So Venus is mostly, as far as I can understand, an oxidized system, because the water dissociation has led to hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen escaped to space. The oxygen has been captured mostly by carbon, some by sulfur. It will also be captured by nitrogen. So there may be the nitrogen, if it can be seen, other than in molecular form on Venus, is probably in the form of nitric acid. So as far as I can see, chemically, none of these compounds are conducive to the development of life in an atmosphere of Venus. I'm skeptical about it, as you can see. And I'll be the first to admit I'm completely wrong, but I don't think so.
All right, so we got one last guess here for Alfie. A life-forming iron event.
A life-forming iron event.
Yes.
Okay, that's quite close. It's quite close. And so I think I should give the prize to this person. And
Well, I have one, see if this is closer. I've got another guess from here in the room. A large ferrous impact event.
that is almost spot on, because what I had in mind was a large ferritic intrasolar extraterrestrial. It's impossible to get, right? So I think your last guess is even closer still. I tell you what, what I'll do is I'll give a calendar to both of those guesses. If you could say again what they were, Gordon.
Oh, so there's Joe. So Joe, if you could email someone on council, either events or speakers at raskvancouver.com or president@raskvancouver.com, and we'll get your email address so we can send that on to Peter. So that was a life-forming iron event.
Yeah.
And the other one was a large ferrous impact event.
Yeah. Those are pretty good guesses. So mine was a large ferritic intrasolar extraterrestrial. And of course, I'm referring to the object itself that hit. But anyway, I think that's pretty good. So if these people could make contact with me, and then as soon as the 2022 calendar becomes available, I'll break open my piggy bank and get that sent.